You also had some discussions with Malcolm X about the Quran and the sound of the Quran when it's being read.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
could you tell us about that exchange and the hard question that he asked you?
Yes, well, yes. The Quran is written in an Arabic that was only used by very highly trained poets, or if someone who wasn't a highly trained poet spoke, that was proof that he was a prophet. So the fact that that words of that beauty and that poetry came out of Muhammad, who was just a merchant and not, if educated at all, not highly educated, that was proof that he was a prophet of God. And all Muslims, and the Prophet taught that the genius of the Quran is in the language. And the Prophet taught that there is a Quran in heaven that was co-created with God. Now, I don't figure out what was co-created with God, but anyway, that's the book from which God gave Moses the Old Testament. And this is the Muslim belief. And God then gave Jesus an improvement on that. And then God gave Muhammad the completion, all that humans need to know. Now, that's only a tiny part of this Quran, which has all knowledge, is in heaven. But that's in Arabic in heaven. Because one of the effects of Muhammad was to unify the Arabs, those who spoke Arabic. And they had been terribly divided while they were pagan. And Islam is essentially, and this interested him very much, Islam is essentially a religion against paganism, against any kind of idolatry, including materialism, including worshiping money more than you worship God. Mm-hmm. And he emphasized that, Muhammad did. And when I explained that, he was very surprised by that. He hadn't understood that. And he always thought of Islam as a competitor for Christianity or a competitor for Judaism. But that was not the Prophet's emphasis. He was quite tolerant of Jews and Christians and said that all Muslims should be.
The Malcolm X converted to the Nation of Islam while he was in prison. And after he was released, he quickly moved up. Mm-hmm. Am I right?
Yes.
In that organization. What was the source of the difficulty for him then with identifying with Sunni Islam?
It was largely organizational, administrative. There's not a great deal of theology in Islam. God is one. There's going to be a judgment day, and God is greater than anything. Allahu Akbar doesn't mean God is great or God is greatest. It means God is greater than. Anything you want to put after that, God is Allahu Akbar. So that's why it's repeated so often in crowds when they're chanting and so forth. Mm-hmm. It just means God is greater than anything. And so it's really a sign of human impotence and the power of God.
So the difference then between the Nation of Islam and
was organizational.
It's all organizational.
A lot of it was organizational. And the main difference is that Islam is not a religion of hate. There are Muslims that try to use it that way, as did Elijah Muhammad. Mm-hmm. But it is not a religion. But it's not a religion primarily of love, the kind of love that the absolutely unconditional love, which is what we Christians consider to be the main quality of God. But it's a religion of practical, and it's all encompassing. Islam is the government, it's a religion, it's everything. And Islam never, nothing in the Quran, nothing in the teachings or the actions of Muhammad have any allowance for anything except Islam being over everything. That is a world religion. He doesn't allow for Muslim nations, doesn't allow for Christian nations, Jewish nations. Islam is going to be a world religion in its theory. So the nationalism doesn't fit in Islam at all.
Okay. But still, his break from the Nation of Islam was a very difficult choice.
Largely because of his love and admiration for Elijah Muhammad, whom he had become disillusioned with. Okay. So that was easy. He was, I think, by the time he had finished the pilgrimage, he was broken from the world of Islam, of the Nation of Islam. But he hadn't decided what he wanted to do. And his choices were to be a Sunni or Shia, or to start his own religion, or to go back into the Nation of Islam and, reform it into an orthodox religious group. Islam is very tolerant of new converts. They make no problem. For instance, Islam has a rule of 4 wives. You can't have more than 4 wives at a time. And you can only have 4 if you treat them all equally, and that's pretty difficult. But if an African chief who has 15 wives converts, Islam doesn't make him get rid of 11.
Oh.
They're very tolerant. In Christianity, if you've got 2 wives, they make you get rid of the other one. I mean, it's so Christianity is not very successful in conversions in Africa, whereas Islam is, because the Prophet had said, it doesn't matter if the first person doesn't become a really perfect Muslim, his children will be. So it's a more practical consideration. But we didn't finish the thing about the Quran. The language of the Quran is so beautiful that people listen to it fascinated, whether they can understand. And few Arabs understand the Arabic of the Quran. They appreciate it something like you would appreciate listening to a symphony, but also listening to the music of Verdi's Requiem, something that's very spiritual, that touches your soul. And when we talked about that, Malcolm X, who knew no Arabic at all except to say a few prayers, and he memorized without even knowing mostly what the words meant, he said that he felt very inspired by hearing the Quran read, and he had recordings of the Quran. It's often read in a sort of a sing-song, very beautiful, and I have some recordings of it, and he said that he felt that, and so some of the other black Muslims had felt that too, without understanding the words at all. But then we got into the trouble. This is what you were hinting at. After I had answered all these questions, he said, well, if you know so much about Islam, why haven't you become a Muslim? And many people in the Middle East asked me this question, because I did study Islam for years before I went to the Middle East and after I went to the Middle East. And my answer is that I'm satisfied with being a Quaker, and I don't feel the need to change anything. But in truth, I find the lack of challenge, spiritual challenge, to keep growing and getting closer and closer, lacking. And I find the lack of emphasis on love too different from what I grew up with. And so that's why. But it's not a satisfying answer to my friends. And I had friends in Gaza that the wife would never come out. I would never see the wife and so forth until she heard me talking about prayer, and that she was surprised to learn that Christians pray. So the misunderstanding between people is very
misconceptions.
Deep, yes.
Absolutely.
And so eventually I was accepted entirely as a brother in the family, and I would stay for days with them in Gaza when I was teaching in Gaza. And she didn't veil or didn't even cover her hair in the house. So I was accepted as one of the family. And, but he found that difficult because he was a person. he was definitely a missionary in personality. He wanted everyone to agree with him.
You also accompanied Malcolm X to a speech he gave at AUB.
I arranged it for him to speak to the Palestinian students there. Well, when he finished speaking, a young man from Nablus, from a well-to-do, privileged family, said, Mr. X, and then everybody tittered because this was a funny name as far as they were concerned.
Oh.
And he said, there are 20 million African Americans in America. He used the word black at that time. If you all voted for Palestine and against Israel, then Palestine would get its what it justly needs, what it deserves. Well, Malcolm shot back at him. Well, what did you Palestinians ever do for the blacks in America? You're buying up all the Palestinians coming to this country are buying up the stores in the slums. You treat us worse than the Jews used to in the slums. And this guy didn't quite know what to do. And he said, furthermore, you don't understand American politics at all. It isn't the Jews in America that support Israel. It's the Christian fundamentalists in America who believe that because Israel is being reestablished, then the second coming is near. And of course, they don't understand that Israel is a socialist, nationalistic experiment. It's not a religious return. The religious were only a small percentage, 5 or 6%, when Israel began. It's now 26%. Mm-hmm. But they were very few in the beginning. In fact, the religious Jews, and many religious Jews still, are against Israel because Israel is not supposed to be reestablished until the Messiah comes. And so they believe that this is a false Israel. Okay. But the American Christians have been convinced that Israel is the will of the Lord,
and
they must support it, and that's why Congress gives them unlimited whatever they want. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's where the support is. So he says, you don't understand American politics. If you're really interested as a Palestinian, then you need to understand American politics. And this boy was quite shocked. The Palestinians learned a lot from his visit.
From him. And soon after he left Beirut, 10 months or so later, he was assassinated in New York. So this was a difficult time in American politics. It was in the 1964, 65 that he was 65. He was killed.
He was killed. Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit then about why you wanted to remain anonymous as the person who was talking with Malcolm X in Beirut.
Well, I wrote this an account of this several years later. I wrote down a lot of things at the time, but I wrote an account of it later in the third person because the people who opposed Malcolm X didn't want anything to come out about the spiritual nature and the positive things about his pilgrimage. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote it in the third person, the article that I wrote about it, which I think we're going to put on the web.
Yes.
So that will be available, a fuller account of that account. But he made up his mind and was quite sure that he wanted to be a Sunni. But he was very interested in Sufism. He was really interested in Sufism. Now, of course, many Sufis believe that Sufism started thousands of years before Islam. That this idea of spiritual, coming close to God through spiritual discipline, through chanting, through rhythmic dancing, through the dancing of the dervishes. Mm-hmm. They're Sufis. And the Sufism is very strong in the foothills of the Himalayas in Central Asia. And there are those that believe that was the beginning of Sufism, not with Islam. And the Saudis who control who goes to Mecca to the pilgrimage will not allow a Muslim who they know is a Sufi, they won't allow him to come on pilgrimage.
that right?
Well, this is an old story in Islam. In the year 1000, Ibn Tufa'il wrote a wonderful book called Hay Ibn Yaqzan. And it's the story of a little boy, a baby that was put into a basket, illegitimate child of a princess, and he floated out to an island, and a female deer, a doe, found him and nursed him and raised him. Well, when he was about 6 or 7, she died. This is the story. Of course, it's a wonderful fiction. And he wanted to know what was the difference between life and death. So he took her body apart. And even this is the year 1000, he understood about the circulation of blood. He understood the importance of breath as the difference between life and death. And in Arabic, the word breath and soul are the same.
Oh.
Interesting. But anyway, he grew up, and as he grew up, he learned everything that one needs to know in Islam. He became a perfect Muslim by himself, by nature. And then 2 young men, one the son of the prince on the mainland, came over to the island, met him. The story doesn't explain how he learned Arabic and so forth. But anyway, don't worry about practical things. This is a fable. And one of the men, not the prince, but the other one, believed in approaching to God, getting as close to God as you could. But the young prince believed that you just did the practical things that were required to be a good Muslim. Well, the 3 of them went back to the mainland, and they discussed this endlessly. And then the father of the prince died, and he took control. The other 2 went back to the island and continued to pray and become closer and closer to God until they just floated off. And this is a story in the year 1000. But that difference between whether the duty of a religious person is to try to approach God or simply to carry out the requirements that God sets for man. And that's what the Sufis are on the side of approaching God, and Islam is very strongly on the side of just doing the practical things that have been set out for you. So,
that's in some ways a very small difference, but
it's everything.
But it's everything.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So we talked a great deal about that, and of course, he wanted to know more about Arabic and the Arabic language and where the language came from and so forth, because he found it very difficult. Mainly because he wanted to start off being able to preach in Arabic. He wanted to that's why it's more difficult for an older person to learn language than a younger person. A child can learn language quickly because a child needs 500 words or so, and maybe 10 sentence patterns. I want and give me, and don't do this, do that. That's what it. But Malcolm X wanted to discuss philosophy in Arabic. And I've been working on Arabic for 60 years now, and I have a hard time discussing philosophy in Arabic. And so do the Arabs, incidentally.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Well, in retrospect, then, what do you think what did you take away from your encounter with Malcolm X, and how has it changed you?
It's very difficult anytime that you deal with somebody who is 100%, who is completely given over to a belief. Mm-hmm. And the intensity of Malcolm, I was not comfortable with him at all, ever. Right? Not even at the end when he left. And neither were the Hopes. And as I said, that it wasn't that he couldn't sit down with me. Marion said that he never sat through a meal with them. He'd get up and pace around, and then come back and sit down at the table and eat some more, and then get up and pace around.
He was just such an intense personality.
Yes,
had so many questions, wanted to know all the answers.
Yeah. Martin Luther King didn't have that. Martin Luther King struggled with the decisions he made against the war in Vietnam and the other things. He really struggled with it, But when he made his decisions, he stuck to them.
Mm-hmm.
But he was not that difficult to be around, though he frightened people white people in the South much more than Andy Young did. And when Andy went to work with the Southern Christian Leadership Council to work with voter registration and literacy, Malcolm immediately recognized that whites did not find him threatening, and so that's why Andy was pushed forward to do the negotiating and so forth with chambers of commerce and so on. But Malcolm, Martin Luther King, was a very, very different personality, and he was from an entirely different strata within the black community, and was a brilliant intellectual. The only thing they had in common really was Boston. Martin Luther King had gone to Boston University where he did his PhD, and Malcolm had been a thief and an operator and in jail in Boston.
But yet there are ways that Malcolm X had contributed to the civil rights movement in the United States.
Yes, because he personified the impatience. And between Marion and Ed, Marion didn't want to wait. Marion was one of these people that she and a white friend would get tickets to a theater in Washington and go and make an issue of it. Ed, who was almost as white as I am, was very, very patient and very quiet and very non-confrontational.
Mm-hmm.
And there was that difference between Malcolm and Martin too, the confrontational part of it.
Did your views about Malcolm X change after you met him?
I had first read about the Nation of Islam before Malcolm became a part of it. Alex Baldwin, isn't it? Alex Baldwin? They wrote The Fire Next Time, and it came out first in the New Yorker magazine.
Okay.
And I had several back issues, and when I read the first part of it, I stayed up all night finishing it. I couldn't finish it. It was so frightening,
mm-hmm.
because the hatred and the justifiable anger in the black community that they had tapped into was really frightening to me. And I was very interested to meet someone like Malcolm X. But I was more upset than satisfied by anything I learned with him, because I didn't really have an answer of how to respond to his anger and hatred. It was more than anger; it was real deep hatred. And I can't help thinking now, and I was thinking on Tuesday, how differently Malcolm and Martin would have seen the inauguration of Barack Obama.
How so?
Well, I'm not sure that I think that Malcolm would have said something like, "It's about time, and what are you celebrating for? This should have been happening 50 years ago." I mean, something really aggressive like that. And I think Martin would have held a very quiet prayer session of thanksgiving. And I certainly felt overwhelmed with gratitude that I lived to see this.
Oh, absolutely. I think we all do.
I'd met Ed Hope once many years ago, and hadn't remembered it until after Malcolm was there. We started thinking. And when I found out, I went to the U.S. Naval Academy, and I was in the class that graduated the first black at the Naval Academy. And all during his first year, he got threats for his life. and his name was Wesley Brown. But when he arrived, there were a group of people that told us we shouldn't speak to him and so forth, and there were a small group that immediately went to help him. Mm-hmm. And we figured out ways to get the 60% who wouldn't risk much, but were sort of in between. We knew that maybe there were 15 or 20% that were dead against him and 15 or 20% for him or favorable, but the 60% that wouldn't risk their careers in the Navy to do anything for or against him.
One way or the other.
We wanted them out of the way. So we invited as many people from outside to come. We invited Eleanor Roosevelt to come. I even got Shirley Temple to come. My sister was head of the Shirley Temple fan club, and I got Shirley Temple to come to visit him, so that the other midshipmen who were against him would realize that it was publicly known that there was a black at the Naval Academy. Mm-hmm. And one of the people that came was the highest black naval officer during World War II. There were generals in the Army in World War I, black, that went to West Point, but they were not in the Navy. And so one of the people that came was Lieutenant Commander Ed Hope. He was a PhD in engineering from MIT, and he had a commission. And of course, he was in engineering, so he wasn't in command of men. So it worked all right. But he brought his young son, Jim, over to visit on a weekend. And I met him then. So we remembered that after Malcolm had been to AUB.
Wow.
So, but, see, I went to seminary with Andy Young. Mm-hmm. And we talked about Andy, and of course he thought that he was just a sort of a pale whitey, I mean, as far as he was concerned. He didn't have much tolerance for anybody. And well, one thing that I told him about, and this would be worth keeping, in Islam, between 700 and 1200 in Spain, and about the same time in Baghdad, there were two entirely different relationships between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. In Baghdad, the Muslims tolerated Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, because there were many Zoroastrians in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley at the time of the Muslim conversions. And they were tolerated. They paid an extra tax, 10% of their value every year. It was quite heavy. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't be in the government. They couldn't have certain jobs. In Spain, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and there weren't any Zoroastrians there, not only accepted each other, they appreciated each other. They went to each other's feasts, they went to each other's services, and this was a very great period. It wasn't toleration, it was acceptance. Now, toleration means I'll let you be what you are till you get smart enough or lucky enough to be like me. Right. But that's what happened in Baghdad. And when the Mongols came, the Christians and the Jews and the Zoroastrians collaborated with the Mongols against the Muslims. In Spain, they got along with each other wonderfully until Rome took over. Rome got interested about the First Crusade was really about Spain, not about Palestine. The Pope found that the Christians in Spain were really quite Unitarian in their theology, like the Albigensians who had been killed in southern France for their heresy. And so it was easier for the Visigoth Christians in Spain to get along with Jews and Muslims because they were God-centered, not Jesus-centered. Mm-hmm. And so, but they did get along very well, and they had this wonderful flowering of culture. The Jews, the Jewish religion had its greatest flowering of poetry and theology and everything in Spain in that period of any time in history until the 20th century. Oh. But it was in Arabic. They all spoke Arabic. They wrote Jewish poetry and Jewish theology in Arabic. And Maimonides, a great Jewish philosopher, was actually a prime minister when he left Spain. He was a prime minister in Cairo. And he was a great doctor and a great theologian and so forth and so on. But it was Jewish, but he appreciated Islam and appreciated Christianity. And there was this great exchange. And I think that that the lesson that we need to learn is that America, as Obama said on Tuesday, is a patchwork of all kinds of different people. We could be the example to the world if we accept each other, not if we tolerate each other or if we fight with each other.
It takes acceptance and actually embracement.
Yes, and really appreciate all these differences intellectually. One of the things that educates people best is to work with differences, cultural differences,
right.
Disciplinary differences, interdisciplinary differences, is the greatest stimulant to intellectual growth and creativity. And we have this chance to do that in this country and to show the world that people of great differences, and it's happened in spite of ourselves. We have greatly benefited by new immigrants coming in, by all the very different cultures that we have and so forth. And but let me get back to Brown. Wesley graduated. I went to the graduation so that I could, I didn't graduate, but I went to his graduation so I could be the first to shake his hand.
Uh-huh.
I lived to be invited to the Naval Academy 3 years ago, to the breaking ground of a $46.5 million athletic center named for Wesley Anthony Brown.
What a wonderful story.
And when I went, there were 2 black admirals and a black female captain who was a graduate of the Naval Academy, a present. And it just, I lived to see that day. And I felt like I did this Tuesday. That we've come a long way. We've got a long way to go.
But we have made some progress.
We've come a long way.
And, we have made some progress. Yeah. And I think one of the things that struck me reading the information that you gave me about Malcolm X was how really surprised he was to see people of all different colors.
In all different cultures.
In all different cultures, really, and that made absolutely no difference. Their purpose was the same, and they were able to embrace each other without regard for race or culture. And I think that's an important lesson we could all learn.
Well, one thing that Malcolm mentioned, and which I've always felt, when men line up, and unfortunately it's the men that line up, the women pray more private, when the men line up to pray together, there is a bonding. Now maybe it's the bonding of all equally far from God, but it's a bonding that there's no equivalency in Christianity. When my students would break from a meeting that we were having in order to pray, I would almost ache to be with them because of that closeness. And Malcolm, that's where I got through to Malcolm. When I mentioned that, I could see in his face that he had felt the same thing. And there was the first relaxation that I saw in that face at all was yes. And that's when he asked me, then why aren't you a Muslim? That's what triggered it. And because, yes, I can appreciate that, but there are other factors involved too. And so.
Well, thank you very much. It was certainly an interesting story to hear about your encounter. And you have written an article based on your encounter with him in Beirut, and that is going to be on your website. Is that correct? On your
Yes. I don't know how it'll be. I'm technically challenged.
We're going to get this up in an electronic format for you then.
So somehow people who've watched this.
We'll have a link to it.
We'll have a link to it so that they can read that.
So watch the podcast and watch for the link to your article.
Yes.